Oh, here we go. I'm going to hit the go live button. And we are ready to go.
All right. Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Kanek Aguirre. I am the chair of the NVTC Wamada committee, and sorry that we're starting a little bit late. Looks like we had some technology issues, mainly on my side, but it is 6:11 p.m. and I'd like to welcome everyone to this meeting tonight. So, given the ongoing COVID-19 public health emergency, we are conducting this meeting electronically. NVTC staff followed the procedures and guidelines in the legislative amendment to give notice to the committee, commission, staff, and the public. Also, this meeting is simultaneously being broadcast to the public on YouTube. I'd like to highlight a few important reminders. I would like to ask the committee members hold their questions and/or comments until the end of each presentation. Because of the size of the group, if you would like to ask a question or make a comment, please unmute yourself during the discussion sections. Please verbally direct any questions to staff and/or committee members by stating their name in the question. Also, please mute your microphone when you are not speaking to help cut down on the background noise. So now I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Duvetter, NVTC's WMATA program manager, to call the roll to identify commissioners and NVTC staff that are present on the call.
Thank you, Chairman Aguirre. Please respond here when you hear your name. Mr. Alcorn.
I am here.
Mr. DeFerenti.
Here.
Mr. Letourneau.
Here.
Mr. Meyer.
Here.
Mr. Smedberg.
Present.
Mr. Snyder.
Here.
And as a reminder, NVTC bylaws state that committee meetings are open for any commissioner to attend. And I believe I see Mr. Turner.
I'm here, but I'll be leaving early, so thank you for having me.
No problem. Thank you for coming. And is there anyone that I missed? Any commissioners? I think I see everybody. All right. Well, we certainly have a quorum. I'll now identify staff and include their titles for the benefit of the listening public. We have Executive Director Kate Mattice, Director of Finance and Administration Scott Kalkworth, Director of Policy and Programs Alan Fye. I'm WMATA Program Manager Andrew DeVetter. We also have Program Analyst Zach Smith on, and Greg Potts from Government Relations at WMATA is on as well. I'll turn it back over to the chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. DeVetter. All right, so again, according to legislation signed by the governor, in response to the COVID-19 public health emergency, a public body or governing board convening a meeting during the declared emergency shall provide the public an opportunity to comment. In advance of this meeting, NVTC solicited written comments. Staff captured these public comments via Google Forms on NVTC's website, and comments received by 3 p.m. today were provided to commissioners ahead of the meeting. Andrew, did we receive any comments?
We did. We received 3 comments that I forwarded to the committee members earlier this afternoon. The first 2 commenters noted recent Metro Rail track work that they felt was not appropriately communicated to riders that resulted in significant unannounced disruptions to service. The commenters implored WMATA to better communicate this kind of work with its customers and asked the commission to advocate on behalf of Virginia transit riders to achieve that outcome. The third commenter asked that WMATA run more trains, fully restore Metro bus and commuter bus service to pre-pandemic levels, and that buses and trains run later at night. And hand it back to the chair.
Thank you, Mr. DeVetter. I'd also like to give a shout out to the rest of the NVTC staff who are working behind the scenes to help make this meeting successful. You know, technology is great until it isn't, so it's always important to have our behind the scenes folks making sure that things are running smoothly. So now I'd like to turn to the first item on our agenda, the January 21st NVTC WMATA Committee meeting summary. So this is just going to be a quick review of our WMATA committee meeting summary. Do any committee members have any comments or questions on the summary? And friendly reminder, we do not need a motion or anything for these, and I'm going to take that as we are good to go with our summary. So jumping to item number 2, our 2021 annual report on the performance and condition of WMATA. Since the landmark transit funding legislation in 2018, NVTC has been legislatively required to produce an annual report on the performance and condition of WMATA. NVTC's bylaws charge the NVTC WMATA committee with providing staff with guidance on updates to the annual report. This will be the 4th annual report produced by NVTC, and this is one of 2 work sessions for the committee to provide staff with feedback. In light of the comments from the Virginia WMATA board members at the last commission meeting, I've asked staff to use this annual report update to help structure and facilitate conversations the committee wishes to have regarding WMATA's recovery and fare strategy. So Andrew, I'm going to kick this over to you.
All right, thank you, Chairman Aguirre. I'll now go over a slide deck covering our approach to updating the annual report. The slides are on the screen and provided in advance of the meeting on the website. And I will pause towards the end of the annual report slides to turn it back to the chair to facilitate discussion. So let's go ahead and jump right into next slide. So as mentioned, the 2018 transit legislation, which created dedicated funding, also included a mandate for the commission to produce an annual report to the Governor and General Assembly on the performance and condition of WMATA. In order to take on these new duties, NVTC tasked the WMATA committee to provide staff with feedback where relevant on the report. The table on the screen shows the structure of the report, which is guided by what's in the legislation. As we did last year, staff will use the preface and introduction to give a background and context of COVID's impacts on WMATA, including federal aid, WMATA's safety efforts during the pandemic, et cetera. And we'll highlight ongoing recovery efforts to make this report as current as possible, since it has a December submission date and a lot can change between now and September. The second chapter is on the uses of the dedicated capital funds, and this is the $154 million of the regional $500 million. And we will continue to do the annual reporting at a CIP program level of what projects WMATA spent the funding on. For this year, we propose adding additional narrative about WMATA's strategy and implementation of dedicated capital funding debt and its importance to the CIP, as it's been several years, and we're learning a lot more about that strategy. And the last 4 chapters are on safety, reliability, ridership, and financial performance data that we collect every year from the National Transit Database, as well as WMATA's performance reports. Next slide, Zach. The chapter where we seek the most guidance and feedback from the committee is the chapters to reduce the growth in costs and improve efficiencies at WMATA. This topic is spelled out in state code. And last year's report had over 22 recommendations that we consolidated into 4 broad categories that are shown on the screen. Rebuilding Metro Rail and Metro Bus ridership, improving operational efficiency of rail and bus, increasing non-fare revenues, and controlling cost escalation. Last year's report gives additional detail on each of these recommendations and tracks WMATA's recent progress on them where applicable. Next slide, Zach. For this year's report, staff proposes using the committee's discussions on recommendations, or staff proposes focusing rather on recommendations to rebuild Metro Bus and ridership, given conversations with the Metro Board, but also the impacts of the pandemic. Strategies that rebuild ridership and fare revenue, reduce the growth in costs, and thereby make WMATA more efficient, tying back to the legislative purpose. The other thing we'll do when we update the 2021 report is try to streamline updates to WMATA's progress on significant milestones or achievements on, those 22 recommendations we mentioned previously. Next slide, please. At the May Commission meeting, the Virginia Metro Board members gave an update on the board's conversations around recovery. They shared that WMATA staff will keep the board apprised of ridership trends and recommend service changes as needed. The disruptive events like COVID offer the opportunity to revisit policy around service and fares, and that the board is having a strategic conversation on fare policy, and that they do look to this committee as well as our jurisdictions for ideas or feedback as those conversations proceed. And the chairman has asked us to use the format of this annual report update to help structure that conversation. That conversation did start at the May Commission meeting, as I mentioned, where we did hear an interest in adjusting rail service patterns to accommodate some level of all-day service, an interest in exploring how WMATA receives fares from riders who are federal employees, and reinforcing that WMATA's recovery needs to be fiscally sustainable and enduring. Since that time, WMATA staff shared some customer research findings that we shared with commissioners last week. For Metrobus, nearly 3 in 5 pre-pandemic bus customers have returned to riding bus, although many are taking fewer trips. For rail, the research found that fare price is not a barrier to the return of most rail riders. The rail riders are looking for service that is clean, not crowded, and frequent. They also found that 3 in 4 customers would feel safe riding rail after they're vaccinated, and that telework is the main obstacle to the recovery of commute trips. For example, they expect that those that return to work in the office will be teleworking somewhat still and thus making less trips overall. Next slide. NVTC's annual reports have made a number of recommendations over the last few years about fare or service-related strategies to rebuild ridership and revenue. This slide shows what we've recommended in previous reports. We've recommended adjusting rail service to match demand during the pandemic and subsequent recovery period, improving weekend rail service by better balancing maintenance activities and the impacts of service disruption on ridership, running all 8-car trains during the peak to help improve operational efficiency, developing, expanding, enhancing fare pass and other pass products to meet unmet demands and encourage offerings to the convention and tourist market. And the idea of a family pass is something we've talked about here that fits neatly within this category. We've also talked about adopting a set it and forget it model by turning riders into subscribers and making it easy and seamless for riders and employees to integrate smart benefits, other transit benefits, the mobile app, monthly passes, etc. And lastly, we've talked about lowering the price of parking at underutilized stations. This was done at West Falls Church several years ago. Next slide, Zach. At this point, NVTC staff are proposing the following 4 major themes for rebuilding ridership and revenue recommendations in the annual report. They're on your screen. The first here is to use the American Rescue Plan Act aid to prevent layoffs, sustain and improve service levels throughout a multi-year recovery period, and position WMATA for sustainable long-term ridership and revenue recovery. WMATA anticipates approximately $1 billion in aid and has programmed $193 million in the already approved FY22 budget, and this aid does expire in October of 2024. The second is to adapt rail and bus service to reflect new travel patterns and attract riders during the recovery period. And the third is to implement fare policy changes that improve revenue and ridership, remove barriers to access, and retain newly returning riders. Many of our past recommendations on fare policy do fit within this category. And then the last, of course, is a repeat from last year to communicate and encourage a safe return to transit. Next slide. So staff has generated a number of discussion questions that are on the right hand of the slide. We've repeated those big 4 themes on the left. And so before I kick it off to the chair, I think the main 4 things that staff are looking for is this the right direction? How would the committee like to further define these, as they are intentionally broad? And does the committee want us to carry anything over from previous years? It goes along with number 2. Is there anything the committee would like us to bring back, explore, as we're going to talk about this again at the June 30 meeting? And then are there any, as WMATA plans for recovery, are there any ideas or recommendations where the annual report scope might not be the right place, but it's still something you'd like to talk about and relay to the Virginia board members? So those are the 4 discussion questions, and at this point, I will turn it back to the chair to get us started.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Just real quick before we start responding to these discussion questions, I'd just like to remind everybody that this is going to be our first conversation on the topic. We will have another opportunity to discuss the annual report on June 30th as well. But before we do dive into everything, I would like to give an opportunity to our Virginia WMATA board members if they'd like to do any framing for the committee. So Mr. Smedberg or Mr. Letourneau, I don't know if you'd like to jump in at this time.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. This is Paul Smedberg. I think, from my perspective anyway, I think keeping this at a pretty high level at this point, I think is important. I think differentiating between fare policy and fare structure, is an important distinction here. And I think just big picture, I think, and the one thing that WMATA, is going to be sort of struggling with, if you will, in the past, the traditional rider, for the most part, and where Wamada made the money to pay for the system was on rail, and it was with the 9 to 5 transit commuter. The one thing the pandemic did was definitely speed along the whole telework, practice for a lot of folks. And so the way people commute and everything is not, it's going to look very different. So I think we have to look outside of the traditional 9 to 5, sort of format, if you will, and we're beyond the addition of the Silver Line and the addition of the Potomac Yard Metro Station. How do we grow the system? Is it with weekend passes? Is it with the 7-day passes like they do in New York, or 3-day passes? Thinking longer term. Younger people, the development that's going on in and around metro stations, particularly with residential, making sure people, use transit. And as the chairman said, this is not the first and only conversation. I mean, this is going to be an ongoing conversation. But one I know that, Matt and I are going to have to take, very seriously, because there's some pretty big strategic decisions that are going to have to be made over the next, 9 to 12 months. So anyway, that's all I have to say. Matt?
Yeah, I certainly agree with everything that Paul said. Maybe the only other thing I'll kind of add for framing here is there's also kind of the distinguishing between actions or activities we think will increase revenue and actions that will decrease revenue. And sometimes things may increase ridership but not increase revenue. And so what we have to look at, and I made some reference to this at the NVTC meeting, is so we've applied the American Rescue Plan, Recovery Plan Act funds to the extent we needed to maintain service levels of 80% plus for fiscal year 22 starting in July. And that is now kind of built into the budget. That's going to leave us with roughly somewhere north of $600 million left that's unallocated. That will be I think the board's going to have to assume that that's the money that we will have that will last us through 24. So, what is the need going to be in fiscal 23? And potentially fiscal 24, and how much of that money do we need to plug whatever hole may exist there? And I don't necessarily have the answer to those questions, but it does affect what we do now, because anything that we sort of spend now is money that's not available later when we may need it to just maintain good service. So that said, I think that, as we look at, as Paul said, I think with the patterns that have changed as much as they have, then there may be opportunities to sort of structure service in a way that doesn't necessarily increase costs. It just spreads it out differently. The one thing that I did get clarification on in between the time that we had our commission meeting and now, as a result of our last board meeting, was how slow it takes, to kind of turn the aircraft carrier. So we had a lot of discussion around Labor Day as kind of being a focus of when people are going to be coming back to the office, and questions about whether Metro is going to have adequate service at that time. And the issue is Metro pretty much has to decide within the next couple of weeks what the Labor Day service levels will be, because of the bidding process and the agreements with unions and things like that make it not very easy to be really nimble. You can't just simply snap your fingers and add service if suddenly we see a surge in July and August. Now, certainly there's always a negotiation that can take place with the unions to try to, perhaps get some relief and speed things up. But that's the baseline assumption. So it's kind of what you see is what you're going to get right now for Labor Day, which is roughly kind of that 80 to 85% range. But the board is kind of looking beyond that, and Metro has identified opportunities to add back some service if it's needed, kind of after Labor Day. But then there's this other discussion, which I think is separate, which is really, from sort of a fare structure standpoint, what sort of things do we want to look at? And some of the things would include elimination of peak fare, spreading it out, looking at the length of trip scenarios. Do they make sense? Should we be looking for maybe, it might be frankly more advantageous for Virginia if we had a fare structure that, charged a little bit less than it does today for that full length trip. Certainly, I have for years been an advocate of a family pass, even before I was on the Metro board, because I think there's some real benefit there to make Metro cost competitive against other options for families, especially in like a weekend kind of scenario. So I think all those things are and more other ideas that all you have are things that we should go into this discussion with. The only, Paul, I don't know if you just want to address kind of what the board process is. I know we have a special meeting set up now of the finance committee coming up in June.
Yeah, I think
you just want to.
Yeah, and thanks, Matt. And I think we've agreed upon a date, so I think it's on your calendar now.
Yeah, June 2. Yep.
Yeah, so the board, we're going to be having a series of work sessions. This will be the first one, I think, as Matt said, it'll get us through that next 3-month period up to Labor Day. But beyond that, and we're going to start, the discussion, the longer term discussion about policy and structure. And Paul and his team Paul Wiedefeld, the GM, and his team are already, based on conversations they've had with the board already, are starting to run various models, looking at various programs, scenarios. Will there be a rush hour anymore? There might be, but it may only be, it could be stretched out from 6:30 to 10:30. We don't know what what the commuting patterns are really going to look like for folks. So everything is on the table. Matt actually did make a good point. There are a lot of things we probably could do to increase ridership overall, rail / and bus, but yet it may cost the system. So that's something we have to take into consideration. And another thing, while I was thinking of it, one thing that I think gets overlooked is not just things like weekend passes or 7-day passes, but look at all the universities we have. We have GW, we have, I guess, Mason's Graduate Center in Arlington. We're going to have Virginia Tech in Potomac Yard in another year and a half. You have, Georgetown, obviously, and some of the high schools, the private high schools in DC, all near Metro. And, could we have, students buying, student passes, for a period of a month or 3 months, 6 months, or for the year type thing, who knows, just to, get people on transit. So, everything's on the table, but, the board is coming at it, with an open mind, and I think it's going to be a very lively discussion. We have new board members coming on. We have 2 new board members coming on for sure. Possibility of 2 others, we don't know. They've been talking to them. They're going through an orientation right now, and so getting them up to speed as quickly as we can, so they can engage on this. The board, as you know, had a retreat where this was discussed as well. We set out sort of a framework and how to move forward. So, but as Kanik said earlier, we're really going to need your help with this, and guidance in some ways, but definitely your help, and we'll need you in many ways. Andrew will be very busy the next year. So look forward to discussing all of this with you, as I'm sure Matt is as well.
Thank you both for those comments, and definitely for all the work that you guys are doing on the WMATA board as well. Real fast before I turn it over to everybody else, I just want to make a couple quick comments. And I think as Matt said and Paul reiterated, we do have to be cognizant of the fact that, how are we balancing an increase with ridership versus revenue, and that push and pull there that's going to affect the revenue overall. So we have to be careful with that. But also, as Mr. Smedberg brought up, right, like it's not necessarily going to be the traditional 9 to 5 commuter anymore. Telecommute has really changed things. I am really curious to see how we can incentivize other folks to ride the metro rail, as Mr. Letono was bringing up. Is there ways to get families more incentivized to ride the metro? And then the other part of that too is, of course, how are we taking a look at what the demand is for service currently, right? I think about a lot of essential workers that can't telecommute, right? That they can't work from home, and so they are dependent upon the metro system, and this gets to what we're looking at with weekend service and extended hours going further out. Because if we're expecting our economy to fully open, and we're going to have places open till 1 or 2 in the morning, well, how are those folks going to be able to get back home, right? We're expecting them to be at their jobs, but then we're saying, well, tough luck getting back home. So I think that's something else that we have to be taking into consideration when we're looking at all of this. But I want to go ahead and turn it over to the rest of the commission and start taking some questions. You guys will have to forgive me because I can't see all of you at once. And go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, so I like the discussion questions. It kind of can keep us focused. It does seem like the right direction. I think, Paul, you had a suggestion on the third bullet that sounded good to me. As we get into this, the fourth bullet, communicate and encourage a safe return to transit. In some ways, it's probably, we all would agree on that, but how we do that would depend a lot on the assumptions about ridership in September that Matt, I think you referenced, those decisions are being made now. So, I mean, as we order the report, I could envision that fourth bullet kind of moving up in the order. I don't think the bullets are drafted in order that they would appear in the report, but that's a thought that occurs to me. And then the last category, I did want to say, maybe there's just a way of doing a thumbs up or for Paul and Matt. Given the challenges that I see ahead, I mean, I would think that leaving positions when Metro employees retire, to the extent that we can leave those positions unfilled, that could seem fiscally wise. There, of course, are exceptions, but that's in a category that's probably in answer to the fourth question. And I didn't know whether you wanted to go question by question, but I kind of assumed that's the case based on my impressions of Mr. Wiedefeld. And I know that's operational, but I kind of continue to share the fiscal concerns in 2023, given the changes in ridership that I think we all agree on. So hope those are helpful. Broadly, it seems like the right direction to me.
Yeah, and Matt, this is Paul Smedberg. The GM is, there, has a team together that's looking at, the changes that are taking place, obviously, like I said earlier, but, is doing a, sort of a wholesale review of the organization like he did when he came in, getting things aligned properly, people in the right offices and in the right buckets and reporting and what have you. But now, given what's happened over the last year, they're taking a look at things again and seeing how, WMATA and how they're going to operate operationally, moving forward. So, that's probably beyond the scope of this committee, but definitely those conversations and, those types of things are being thought about by, Paul and his senior team. So
Great. I'm just hoping we can avoid layoffs through attrition, but that is outside the scope. So thanks.
yeah, but I think Matt makes a good point though. And Matt, what is it in 23 or early 24 fiscal year? We have potentially a operating cliff. Isn't it?
I mean, it all depends on where we are from a revenue standpoint, but we're almost certainly going to need subsidy that, we're not going to have. So we're going to have to apply the federal money to that. Exactly how much we need is going to depend on how much revenue we have at the time, but you kind of have to be more conservative than not when you are planning these things, as you all know from your own jurisdictional management.
Yeah, and I think, another challenge we'll have as a board will be, the WMATA board will have is, we're going to have to be sensitive to the fact that, the state of Maryland and the District of Columbia and, even our folks, they're not, and Matt, this, you're going to have to be dealing with this at your local level. You're not going to come out of this, in 1 month. I mean, it's going to take a period of time. So it's going to take the state of Maryland, it's going to take the district and us, a period of time to come out of it. So, we have to be sensitive to that as well. Yeah, so it's going to be a balancing act for sure the next couple of years until we truly come out of this.
Mr. Meyer, Mr. Snyder?
I have been through this kind of exercise a number of times in my life in different kinds of organizations, and this has all been a very interesting and appropriate and understandable conversation. Having said all that, we can get hung up on I think it's dangerous to say, okay, well, we're going to have for every 2 FTE that leave, we'll replace with 1. Those are the kinds of macro policies or solutions that really do not address the nuances of the different kinds of challenges that WMATA is facing. We have, we might have 2 people in one functional category leave and we wouldn't replace either one of them. We might have 2 people in another category that leave and we might replace both of them and seek a third one to add to it, because our challenges here are it's like I guess my analogy is it's like squeezing a balloon. You put your hands around one part of it and then something else pops out over somewhere in another place. And before the pandemic, and when we were trying to maintain our ridership and confidence in the safety of the system, that really began this entire remaking of WMATA's culture and focus before the pandemic. And now it's we're trying to get that ridership back, and the last thing we need is for us to make cuts in some critical areas that, if we have 1 or more incidences, could only exacerbate the lack of confidence and the unwillingness of the lack of confidence by riders and the unwillingness of riders to return to the system. So I understand the problem, but I would caution us to avoid what might appear to be easy or broad solutions that really just mirror over some more fundamental problems that we still have to address, especially in the area of safety. And I don't know what else to say on that.
Yeah, Mr. Chair.
Go ahead, Mr. Smedberg.
Yeah, and David, thank you for that. And look, nothing that the general manager, the board does is going to any way impact the safety and the state of good repair, any of those efforts that are underway. I mean that's not going to happen. And again, this conversation I think is probably best, left to the WMATA board or because I think we're sort of getting away from where we really need the help of this committee, and that's on fair policy, fair structure, and sort of planning for the future. I mean, those operational questions and staffing is, I think it's beyond anything that we can control and should necessarily comment on, to be perfectly honest. But nothing about the safe, reliable operation of the system is going to change, even if work, the employee FTEs does change. That aspect of the operation is not going to change. So.
Go ahead, Mr. Snyder.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. One thing I do know is I don't know the answers for sure, but let me throw out a couple observations. The first one is that I think during this period, to the extent that we possibly can, we're gonna have to really operate by nuance and right-sizing the system as rapidly as possible. For example, the notion that we're running so many trains and we have so little ridership is hard for me to justify over the long term. On the other hand, swinging the pendulum the other direction, which was the proposal closing 21 stations and going to 30-minute headways. I mean, that's not really running a system at all at that point. So I think to the extent that we're able to nuance and right size this system going forward. So it may mean, for example, that we don't go back in September. We may not go back to 6-minute headways. Maybe it's 10 minutes or 11 minutes, but and that's just one example among many. The second issue is this notion of moving toward more of a subscription service, and I find that a very attractive consideration. I think we're missing huge portions of the people that live here, the people that visit here, the people that work here, huge segments of the population we're missing. And I recall, and I've used it before and I'll use it again, when you check into a hotel in a lot of European cities, you're given a transit pass. Now, we know you've paid for that through your hotel room, but you're probably going to use that transit pass because it was there and it's frankly more convenient to ride it. And you just sit your car. If you've driven to the region, you just park your car. And because somebody put that pass in your hand and because it was convenient and easy, and you didn't have to go down to the metro station once you figured out where it was, then it takes you 10 minutes to figure out the fare machines. And universities, high schools, church groups, nonprofits, on and on and on. I think there's a tremendous potential here for subscription-based, not purely subscription-based, but large potential here to grow that part of our business. The third issue is, what do you do for essential workers and late night hours? Somehow, I don't think the most efficient service for them and for the system is to provide 8-car trains at 1 a.m. I can't believe that that is the most effective way to deliver service that provides both the maximum benefits for the people that are using it. And it certainly doesn't strike me as the most cost-efficient way. So I think, again, we're going to have to be more nuanced and more flexible about all this stuff than we've been so far. Again, a couple suggestions about the direction to go, some things to think about, as well as some of the larger general considerations. Metro board members, any reaction to any of that?
Well, go ahead, Matt.
Oh, no. I was just saying, I think, Dave, I agree with a lot of what you said there, and I think the approach on the service levels is kind of the one that, from what we've seen so far, that Metro is going to take. I don't think we will get back to 4 and 6 minute headways, but I think we will have good service, not 20 minutes, on weekdays. It'll try to be more of a consistent, somewhere around 10 minute, and make it something that people can kind of rely on. There's this kind of notion of when we had this discussion at NVTC, but how frequent do you need to be so that people don't need to look up the schedule, right? And I think we'll be in that realm for most, for weekday service. I think weekend is going to be challenging. You touched at the end there on the late night service, and I mean that's one of these competing interests between jurisdictions issues, quite frankly. Where it's something that the district has traditionally really wanted, as a way to assist service workers, and I think. But we have already really added back quite a bit of bus service to try to do that and address those needs, because we already were seeing that a lot of the folks in those industries were using bus. And I think it's a conversation that we'll end up having where there will be some competing interests on. But from an efficiency standpoint, a lot of times it looks to me that it's more efficient to simply give people an Uber, than it would be to run the whole system for hours on end for the number of riders that we actually have in those circumstances. So I agree with what you said, and we'll just have to, kind of see how that plays out. But Paul?
Yeah, no, I again, I'll say what Matt said first thing. Dave, I agree with a lot of what you said. But the last point about the late night hours and everything, for now, I think it's getting to a point that's reliable for a lot of folks, that's consistent, reliable, so people can feel comfortable getting back on a good, clean train, reliable train. But Matt's right. I mean, if we were purely a for-profit organization, there was no way we would be providing hours till 2 a.m. for if you look at the numbers, even before the pandemic, even at the height, it would be like 200 people, if that, running a system for 200 people. You have to weigh those factors. But who knows where we'll be coming out of this. It may, the patterns may change totally, and it could look very different. So we'll see.
Let me just underscore one point about late night service. I'm not saying don't offer it. I'm saying how you offer it. And the most cost-effective way
Right.
to provide service that's most useful is the point that I was trying to make there. And subscription-based service, it seems to me offers a lot of potential, and I'm wondering how much research has been done on that. And whether, for example, you all kinds of nonprofits, all kinds of others that could offer Metro Rail passes at a reduced amount, but we're getting reliable and significant chunks of revenue at one time. Maybe that's been explored and it's just kind of a dead end, or not. But it seems to me, again, that as an example, you check into a hotel, you get your transit pass right with your card key in the hotel, and it seems to me that that offers maybe a model that we could build on here more. Thanks.
Yeah, the hotel thing, I know, I mean, that has been looked at. It's honestly just very difficult to get private companies and organizations to buy into that, because I mean, it only works for Metro if somebody's paying for it. And then for them, that's a cost that if they add on to the cost, then they're in competition with others. It's a very price sensitive market. So then, is everybody offering that? Well, it's like airline fares, companies, certain airlines, they bundle their stuff together at a higher fare. And the hotel industry hasn't quite caught up to that, and travelers don't really think like that yet. I mean, it's a great idea, and it's something we should continue to pursue. But I know that in the past, pre-pandemic, there was just difficulty getting buy-in to do it. I think some limited success in kind of one-off scenarios with particular conventions and things like that. And that's probably a good place to start. If you have a ton of people coming into town for a week, let's see if we can get in on, and make it part of the package. But so I think, where our job, I think, as the board, is to sort of challenge the Metro staff to be looking for those opportunities and, being persistent about exploring them. So.
David, and this is Paul. One thing that I'm sort of curious to see when we get some of the information back is, we keep hearing anyway that people are not necessarily price sensitive. I'm not sure I'm actually buying that 100%. And I think, and if they are not price sensitive, how much of that is due to the fact that they have a, $250 or $275, transit subsidy? And I'm wondering, coming out of the pandemic, will there be an effort to maybe do away with that, or do away with part of that? And how does that change it? So that's something, that this committee could, emphasize, that, the importance of maintaining the commuter subsidy in this region, because that's going to be very important, not only for Wamada, but we're also concerned about VRE. I think probably a lot of the VRE members have use that subsidy to pay for their monthly VRE, ridership bills. So, another thing for the committee to, to keep in mind. Dave, one thing and Matt, I think, an idea that has come up, bigger picture in terms of fare structure. We have the most complicated system out there, I think, in the world. I mean, there might be a few others maybe, but we certainly win the prize in the United States. What does that fare structure look like in the future? Do we maintain that? We've got peak of the peak, non-rush. It's just sort of crazy. People look at that board and they get a headache. But in the future, do we look at zones? Do we have 3 zones? Do we have 4 zones? Do we cap, fares at a certain maximum? So I don't know. I think there's a lot that's going to be discussed and on the table.
And Mr. Alcorn, I see that you're waiting to jump in there. I just want to make one quick comment before I get to you. I just want to say, yeah, I definitely agree with a lot of what Mr. Snyder said as well. I guess trying to figure out how to phrase it, because I don't want to say that we manufacture demand, but to the point of looking at schools, looking at churches, incentivizing families, how do we then generate or create our own demand to help fill some of this? And I think to the late night service hours, is there potential, if we do some outreach to restaurants and bars? Are you interested in something like this? And then we could kind of garner some more potential demand, if you will. So I just want to say that real fast. But Mr. Alcorn, please.
Yeah, actually, thank you for saying that. No, I think what you're saying, and also what Mr. Snyder was saying, I think in my mind, we're looking at a pretty fundamental shift in the way Metro thinks about itself. I think in a lot of ways, Metro, especially Metro Rail, has said, well, we're here, we're really needed, and you kind of work around the edges. But I think what the transformation that needs to happen is Metro Rail in particular needs to think of itself in competition with other modes of transportation directly. Mm-hmm. So all these things that we're talking about to make Metro more attractive, I mean, some of it might be fare issues, some of it might be what Paul said, in terms of just making it easier to use. And I think just coming at, I think we have an opportunity over the next year to really shift the mindset within WMATA to be competitive. Because, I mean, right now we're looking at competition from the single occupancy vehicle, at least for commuters. And that's going to be really tough. That's a tough thing to compete against. So I really appreciate all the comments by my colleagues, and let's keep going and pushing for how the system can really be that much better, that it actually can compete in this kind of post-pandemic world.
And Mr. Chair.
Go ahead, Mr. Smember.
Yeah. And Walter, you make I think a really good point, about the mindset within WMATA. It's, that's why the work of this committee and this, report, or maybe even a separate report on some of these bigger issues, is going to be really important, because, Matt and I are really going to have to, be in there, sort of talking it out, so to speak. Because we're really going to have to push staff as well, to make sure that they're exploring all our options and things, and that, Paul has the support and the pieces of information available to help implement change there, because, it can be difficult. It's like, turning the Titanic, as some people refer it to, but it's a very large organization with a lot of, complexities. So, that's actually a really a good point Walter made.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. And I don't want to minimize. I mean, there's a public interest portion for WMATA.
Absolutely.
I don't want to minimize that.
Yeah, no,
right.
This
is not a private company.
Yeah, that'll never
right.
go away. Yeah,
right. But maybe we can sort of adapt and adopt some of those, competitive strategies and mindsets that can help us get through this.
Totally agree. Yep.
And I would add somewhat humorously, hopefully it ends better than the Titanic.
Yeah. Yes.
Definitely.
Yeah, I prefer aircraft carrier. Let's go with that.
Aircraft carrier. There we go. Yeah, it takes a while for the rudder to go in the right direction.
And I know Mr. Turner has to leave early, so I don't know if Mr. Turner, you wanted to jump in at all.
No, good discussion. That's very interesting, but thank you.
Yeah. And I'll just mention, what comes to mind too, because I know I threw out doing outreach to different groups. I know WMATA has their street team, and I think there's already a kind of vehicle, if you will, to try and help do some of this outreach. So definitely looking forward to how we're studying some of this. Any other questions or comments or concerns on this item before we move on to our next item?
Sorry, Mr. Chair, but Paul, your comments sort of dovetail into, is there a separate report that's needed? Is there a different format that's needed? I don't know that I'm asking that we talk about it further, but I think discussion question 3, maybe Kate and the whole team might have a conversation with you, Paul, and Matt or whoever, to see if it would help if we did something different in the report to try to drive that, to make it easier for the two of you in the conversations. That just occurred to me.
Yeah, I mean, I'll leave that up to Andrew and Alan, whomever. Yeah. But it's just just listening to the conversation, and I'm thinking, and Andrew, doesn't this report go to the state?
Yeah, the audience for the report is the General Assembly and the governor, and we are trying to do sort of two things that are related but different in the same conversation setting for ease of use. So, I mean, I think we'll certainly have conversations about how to manage both of those objectives and working with the board. All I can kind of really volunteer right now is that, my direction is to really be as flexible as possible, given how all of this is going. And that's,
Andrew, Andrew, this is Paul. I don't know how Matt feels, but I knowing how this, what this report is for, I would, oh gosh, should I say this? You know, I mean, I think we have to be, you know, careful what we put in here. You know, just
We have to know our audience.
Yes. Let's keep things focused on, you know, what this report is supposed to be about, and then if there are these other bigger picture policy issues that are relevant to us and a different audience, you know, maybe it's a different report or an addendum.
Yeah. So
it's not the main
focus,
because who knows where that conversation could go in Richmond or how it would play out. We don't need that complexity added to all this. It's going to be bad enough.
Yeah, what I was just going to say was, so in terms of the input from the commission on fair structure, fair policy, ridership issues, I think, you know, that we kind of already sort of have the mechanism set up where, you know, Andrew staffs the two of us really effectively and funnels all of the jurisdictional input into each of our meetings, you know, in preparation. We do a call ahead of those meetings. So we have coming up our work sessions. So I would anticipate that, you know, when the material becomes available for the work sessions, the same kind of process would take place, and that input, you know, would be provided to us as it normally would be for, you know, a board meeting, and that way we will have kind of the two-way. I don't know that, you know, we need NVTC to do sort of a special report on this per se, but I think, you know, it will be kind of a separate topic that the board is taking up, and so therefore naturally, you know, the NVTC staff and then all of you and the Metro Committee, as well as your jurisdictional staffs, have the opportunity to sort of funnel the stuff to us. And then, you know, like always, we have to kind of go in and do the best we can with it with our colleagues who may have some different ideas, and just sort of, you know, work that out with WMATA staff and with our colleagues. But I would anticipate that we're set up pretty well with the way that we function for this. I don't know that was always the case, but I think the way that we have the structure now is pretty well set up.
Yeah, and Matt, and Mr. Chair, if I could, Matt, I agree totally. I mean, Andrew does a really great job doing all that, and you know, the stuff he provides is super helpful. I'm just thinking about the document itself. So anyway. Okay.
Yeah, and so for the sake of time, I don't mean to cut off the conversation because I just remind everybody this isn't the last time we're going to talk about it. We will have some other opportunities to discuss it, but I'm going to go ahead and move us on to the next agenda item. So we're going to be taking a look now at the scope of work for the 3% cap working group companion report to the commission. Tonight, the committee will hear from staff on the scope of work for the 3% cap working group's companion report to the commission. In November of last year, the 3% cap working group completed its legislative requirement to submit a report on the 3% cap to the General Assembly. And at that time, the working group recommended following up on its narrowly tailored General Assembly report with a companion report that provides additional details that the working group discussed. With the commission as the audience of this companion report, staff are now going to provide an update to the committee on the scope of this effort. So Zach, I'm going to throw this over to you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair. So indeed, 3% cap working group will reconvene for 2 meetings this summer, one in June and one in July, just to develop that companion report that we said we'd do in the fall. Just to note that the companion report isn't intended to make any new recommendations on the cap, but there are a few additional details and findings that the working group discussed in their meetings that we just want to flesh out for the commission, just because they went beyond the scope of what the General Assembly asked us to do. So tonight, I'll just briefly review the report that we sent in November and just talk a little bit about the scope of our upcoming companion report. And as a reminder, on this slide are the members of our working group, and we were directed by the General Assembly to include local transportation stakeholders, the director of DRPT, and private sector stakeholders. And they'll all be returning to work with us this summer. And just to note that our chair, Katie Crystal, had some conflicts this summer in her schedule, so she won't be participating in the actual working group meetings. So we'll have our vice chair, Kate, step into that role of facilitating the meeting, but we'll definitely keep Chair Crystal updated on what's happening. All right, and like I said earlier, NVTC was tasked by the General Assembly to look at two things, the usefulness of the 3% cap and to determine whether any additional items should be excluded. And so last summer, the working group had 3 meetings where we examined the historical jurisdictional operating subsidies and the current operating budget and found that some of the biggest drivers to the subsidy increases were things like ridership on Metro Rail and changes in fluctuations with service. And we also interviewed WMATA and representatives from Maryland and DC on their perspectives of CAP as well. And so all of that led to our recommendations that we included in the report to the General Assembly, that the CAP is useful in managing the growth of Virginia's subsidy payments to WMATA, and that the General Assembly does not need to exclude additional items from the CAP. And the working group also acknowledged that it's too soon to make any legislative changes to the CAP, given the legislation's recent enactment in 2018. We also said that NVTC would work with DRPT to clarify existing state policy guidance on legislative exclusions. And the working group recommended that NVTC continue to explore the CAP with the scope and timing determined by the Commission. Also, I should note the working group suggested that the CAP be in place for at least 5 budget cycles before it's evaluated, but the Commission can ultimately decide when to revisit it. And so with that, I'll take a brief pause if there are any questions about our report to the General Assembly.
Any burning questions for Zach?
All right.
Zach, thank you for that work on that, but go ahead.
Oh, yeah, no problem. So moving on, as I mentioned before, there were discussions that the working group had that we wanted to document, make sure that they were part of the historical record. So the first meeting on the 9th is where we will review what we found about the historical and current operating subsidies. Also, we will discuss how the CAP interacts with the way WMATA develops the jurisdictional subsidy bill and the CAP's effect on historical subsidy formulas. We'll also take a look at how to engage WMATA and the region on the CAP moving forward. And the working group also developed ideas on different ways to cap the subsidy growth, so we'll talk about how to include those in the report as well. And so this is just a tentative agenda for what we have planned on June 9th. It'll look a little bit similar to this meeting where I'll just go over a detailed review of the November 10th report, and then we'll sort of get into the finer details about the things we've talked about before and what to include in this next report. And so on your screen here, we have some key dates and touch points where we have with the Commission. We'll provide them with a brief sort of overview of what we're doing on June 3rd. Our working group meeting is June 9th. We'll come and update you all on June 30th and the Commission on July 1st. And we have a second working group meeting where we will conclude our findings, and then August we'll sort of wrap it up and write the report, and then the fall we'll present it to the Commission to accept. All right, and that's all I had.
Thank you, Zach, and especially for kind of keeping this on track. I know that we've been talking about this 3% cap for a long time. A lot of work going into this, so really appreciate it. 1 second here. And any other NVTC staff wanted to make any remarks on this? Nope. Okay. So gonna kick this over now to the rest of our commission. Any commissioners have any comments on the 3% cap? All right.
Actually, Kanik, if I could just real quick, is
Go ahead.
Kate on? I thought I saw her earlier.
I am indeed.
Hey,
I just
Kate.
know you got a lot on the agenda, so.
No. Hey, just real quick. Has there been any response, or have you, what's the feedback been? Have you heard anything, or?
So we have not started the companion work, so that the June 9th meeting will be reconvening the working group to dive into that second study. Which again is a lot more on the other side of it. But we have not heard any whispering on the General Assembly side to be doing anything. Okay. So I think that is hopefully our goals have been achieved in the way that GA report was released. But okay. Yeah, this next one is very much getting down to the mechanics really of how our jurisdictions work with WMATA on really the topic associated with budget. So we'll be rolling up our sleeves following that working group meeting on June 9th.
Great, thanks.
Cool. All right. Any other questions, comments? All right, looks good. We're going to go ahead and move on to our next agenda item, which is agenda item number 4, other NVTC program updates. And it looks like we do have a few additional updates from NVTC staff. The first is a reminder about how WMATA is funded in Virginia and how NVTC's subsidy allocation model works. The second is a brief update from staff on the upcoming white paper and options for low fare or no fare transit. And it looks like, Scott, I'm turning this over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So this is an updated version of a chart that shows the mechanics of how WMATA is funded in Virginia. We first prepared the chart a few years ago at the request of a board member, and it's been updated a few times since then. This latest version adds Loudoun County and also updates the Commonwealth's gas tax withholding calculation, which is effective this past July. I really would like to walk through the chart, but in the interest of time, I will not. It is included in the board materials for your review, however. So we can move on, I guess, to the next item, which is the SAM formula. Okay, so the SAM, it really is an important part of NVTC, and it's how the jurisdictions receive BRDT transit funding and gas tax revenue through NVTC. It's a regional approach to funding transit in Northern Virginia. It recognizes that transit systems are somewhat interdependent and how investments in one system can really impact service throughout the entire region. The formula was established by NVTC resolution, and it's evolved over many years with the formula and hold harmless provisions, first included in the Virginia Code in 2019. The formula allocates state transit assistance and gas tax revenues received by NVTC among the local jurisdictions, with Loudoun County becoming a participant for the WMATA subsidies with the start of Silverline Phase 2 revenue service next year. The basic formula is fairly straightforward and looks at the transit funding needs of the jurisdictions using 4 main inputs, which are listed on this slide. However, there are some hold harmless provisions included in the formula that make the calculations a little more complicated than they may appear. Next slide, please. So included with the materials is a document that outlines the history of the SAM formula from its start to the present day. And I pulled a few highlights from that document for this slide. However, I would encourage you to take a look at the complete document if you do have an opportunity. You'll find out in reading through the chronology document, one can see that the SAM was developed and evolved over the years through compromise while trying to keep the allocations fair and all jurisdictions protected at the same time. For example, at sometimes some did not pay their WMATA subsidies, so the SAM tried to address this to keep service running throughout the region. And even in one case, a non-NVTC and non-transit issue between 2 jurisdictions was actually settled as part of the SAM discussions. I want to point out in the middle of this slide, in 1999, the formula was changed to what is pretty much the present day formula. And from what I understand, that took about 3 years of discussions with the jurisdictions on alternative formulas in an attempt to put something in place that all could agree to going forward. And that formula is basically the formula as it is of today. Also want to point out that in 2012, Loudoun County was added to the SAM formula for the WMATA subsidies when the Silverline Phase 2 goes live next year. And one other thing I do want to mention is that with the addition of Loudoun County and the SAM formula, there should not be a decrease in funding through the SAM to the other jurisdictions next year as compared to this year. And this is because it's expected the state assistance to NVTC will increase by more than Loudoun County's share of the SAM formula. And that's all I have. Are there any questions?
Any questions from the commissioners? Mr. Letourneau.
Yeah, appreciate that. And I'm more familiar with this probably than most because of Loudoun's entry and some of the questions around it and some of the questions that have come up in the past about when Loudoun should pay its WMATA subsidy. and then discovering that NVTC sort of was treating it this way with the SAM formula, which also would make sense for Wamada to do. The only question I have about Loudon specifically is, so SAM formula covers both operating and capital. And I think it's clear that Loudon wouldn't receive the SAM formula for operating until revenue service actually starts. But the same resolution in 2012 also has Loudoun County paying capital contributions at the beginning of the year in which service starts. So why wouldn't Loudoun start receiving something from the SAM formula for capital contributions at the same time if that's governed by the same resolution?
Yeah, well, the way we read the SAM formula is that it is in the period when the revenue service actually starts for the silver line. So in that particular quarter, when it starts is when Loudon will start participating in the SAM formula.
For both operating and for capital?
For both operating and capital, that's correct.
I'm not sure I quite get the logic, but just because if Loudon has to start making capital payments earlier, then you would think that the same formula would, for just for capital, would get triggered when the payments start, which is the same as revenue. But I'll say this: I'm asking the question partly because our staff is still sort of perplexed on that topic. So our finance staff. So I know there's been some discussion, and I appreciate everything that you do, Scott, to help us with it, but that is still a bit of a point of contention. So.
Anybody else? All right. Scott, thank you again so much.
Thank you.
All right. The last item on our agenda is going to be a brief update from staff on the upcoming white paper on options for low fare / no fare transit. And I believe I'm throwing this over to Alan.
Yes, thank you and good evening, everybody. I just want to give you a quick update on the work that we've been doing on a white paper within NVTC looking at options for low fare and no fare transit. Some of the work we've been doing is looking at what are the different options that are out there for transit providers to offer to their riders. We have a couple different things we're looking at. There's a continuum that you're going to see next month that shows a whole range of options, ranging from do you have low or no fare options for different populations on certain routes and other different examples. Part of the other work that we're doing in the white paper will be looking at the trade-offs. I know the discussion we've had over the last hour or so about Metro and the recovery has really been a discussion about trade-offs. What do you get for ridership versus cost, et cetera? And these types of policies and programs have the same sort of trade-off discussion. When it comes to implementation, I think we have to it's very important to look at what are the implementation opportunities and what is the scale of it. So we're looking basically at what are the opportunities at a transit provider level, at the local level, and then with Metro. As we both know, the range of financial and political implications and the complexity levels vary greatly, whether you're dealing from, let's use Dash as an example, who's moving forward with a fare-free program versus trying to do that at Metro. So we're trying to be very aware of the sensitivity of the scale of things. And also the fact that some of those decisions will be local decisions, like with Dash, for example, versus if you did something in Metro, it becomes a very regional discussion, a much larger discussion. The other reason to talk about this is it's very timely. It's like, why are we talking about it now? I think right now, one of the things we're looking at is this is just one possible tool of many in the post-COVID recovery discussions that are going to be going forward. Another one is the focus on equity up and down the entire political spectrum, from local governments in Northern Virginia, the Commonwealth, and all the way up to the current Biden-Harris administration. That equity theme has been throughout there, and transit really has a really important role to play within that discussion. And lastly, it's broad. It's across the entire country. Here in Virginia, we're talking about it. You'll see a lot of it at the Virginia Transit Association conference in September, discussions on fare free and equity. GRTC and CAT, those are our colleagues down in Richmond and in Charlottesville, are definitely looking into opportunities for using federal aid potentially to keep their systems fare free for a while. What does that mean? And then also we've got some really big colleagues across the country, MBTA in Boston and LA Metro are looking at it as well. So what we're trying to do is kind of get a snapshot right before we go into the summer recess, something for the commission to think about, a lot of different angles you'll hear about. You're going to hear a briefing on the white paper itself. Also, you're going to hear a presentation from DRPT about their new TRIP program. It's a funding program that will help, specifically designed to help in this world of low fare and no fare. And then also you're going to hear a little bit about Alexandria's case study about what they've done in the last couple of months of deciding to make Dash fare free. So that's a very quick snapshot. We're looking forward to presenting that to you in July and hearing your thoughts and feedback. So I'm happy to take any questions.
All right. Any, Mr. Meyer?
Well, I just wanted to say, I think I've expressed this to the entire commission before. We've been fare free now for 14 months. Yes, we are a very small, somewhat contained bus system, and we do have a partnership with George Mason University, but nonetheless, it's costing us about a half a penny on the tax rate. I've already shared that with you before. We're going to have a day of reckoning sometime in June with my colleagues on council as to whether we're going to continue this. It's factored into our spending plan. I think that we should go forward with it. I know that as transit systems, the larger ones are the ones that are more interconnected, serve more people and serve them in different ways. It becomes a more matrixed decision point. But I can simply say that there are some administrative benefits to it, and there certainly is a public relations benefit to it. It's hard to put a price tag on, and it's squarely in our equity initiative. So, if anybody wants to hold us up as an example, good or not so good, we're doing it, and I'm going to try and make it as extended as long as possible, and I certainly want to make it permanent. But I have others that may vote differently, but that's where we are with it. And it does make things a whole lot easier from an administrative perspective, and in terms of marketing the bus system.
Thank you, Mr. Meyer. Mr. Alcorn.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a suggestion as you put the white paper together, and I guess the 3 bullets at the bottom here, why examine the issue now, kind of get to this, but I think there are different reasons for doing low fare, no fare transit, and maybe making very clear, to achieve the equity objective, here's what you would do, and fleshing that out would be really helpful. If one of the objectives is return to transit, or getting people to get back on Metro Rail, maybe that's a little bit different option. And then, all the different reasons why we would do this, laying that out, and then especially looking to see where there might be sweet spots that, that address multiple things that we're trying to do, I think would be helpful in the white paper. So, kind of thinking about it that way, objectives we're trying to achieve, and then strategies for getting there, and where we could achieve multiple objectives at the same time would be really helpful.
Thank you.
Mr. Snyder, or go ahead. Is that Mr. Letourneau?
Yeah, I was just going to say, so I think the phase 2 here with WMATA is obviously a lot more complicated discussion, and will make for an interesting reading in the white paper. I know, obviously, Canik, your Alexandria system has embarked on this, and it's been talked about in some of the smaller systems. But for WMATA to do it would have a very, very significant effect on subsidies. And this is where it then sort of gets to a secondary conversation, which is how much are the Virginia jurisdictions receiving from WMATA for service? And there, we're very rail dependent, but on bus, over time, as our individual systems have stepped up and expanded, WMATA has receded. And, if you were to look at a route map for the WMATA bus routes, which Paul and I do and did, in fact, at our last meeting, Virginia is not real covered compared to the other two jurisdictions. There's a lot more routes in Maryland and DC than there is in Virginia. So, there is sort of, formulaic ways where this is kind of dealt with, but at its core, the question becomes, if WMATA were to do this, for WMATA itself, we would likely be subsidizing a lot of this in other places, as opposed to putting the money into providing low or no cost transit in our own jurisdictions. And that's just going to have to be a regional discussion about whether that's something we really want to do. The other approach to it is by jurisdiction, do you provide some type of a subsidy or a discount or a, whatever it is for your residents to use on WMATA. And the district has talked about that. Doing that for their citizens. I don't know about all of them, but but some particular group or all of them. And that's something that we could look at as well. And then that would come out of your own jurisdictional budget. And I don't know whether you can sort of require it to be used for that purpose or whether it comes in the form of a smart trip or however it is. And I'm sure that's stuff that we would look at. That's kind of the other approach to doing this. So I'm just throwing these things out there because they're all things that I think Paul and I have talked about a lot when it comes to this discussion. There is some interest in the WMATA board in having this discussion as well. I think given the level of service in Virginia, I have some concerns about whether Virginia sees the value even now in terms of what our overall subsidy is, just because we don't receive as much service as other places do. And it may even be worth a longer, broader discussion about bus in general. I know we just came out of the bus transformation study, but I have suggested before, and I will dare to say it with this group tonight, that it could be more beneficial for Virginia to simply not participate in WMATA bus and to provide all of the service using our own providers, utilizing that subsidy that we are currently providing to WMATA. And so I know that's a little bit of a radical thing to say, but we should be thinking and challenging especially during these times, and that is just something I'll throw out there for folks to think about. So I have said more than enough and got myself in enough trouble, so I'll stop.
No, Mr. Letourneau, I definitely appreciate those comments.
Mr. Mayor, Mr. Chair.
Yes, one second, Mr. Smedberg. Because I was just going to mention, while I was very much in favor of going fare free for our dash system, I did bring this point up to the rest of our body that it is much more complicated than that for the region. So I definitely appreciate those comments. And to your point, where you mentioned, should we come out of funding WMATA bus and do it ourselves? I think that's a good point. I think that given our situation, we definitely have to be looking at everything that's on the table. So thank you for that. Mr. Smedberg, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Actually, my question's for Alan. Alan, beyond just the fare itself, there's been this real push for sustainability. So, the cost of electrification or, CNG / electric hybrid type things or buses. Are we going to, was that discussed as part of that, or are you just solely going to focus in on fares? Because it is part of that bigger picture. Because I can only imagine what the number for WMATA is going to be, given the size of the fleet, just to begin that process of, sustainability.
Yeah, so this white paper, we're focusing strictly on the fare side of things. We're running this through our transit technology program, which has been doing a lot of work with fare collection in Northern Virginia. To hit a little bit on cost, one of the things we are looking at is the cost of collecting fares versus the cost of not collecting fares, and what does that look like? Because there is a large administrative cost that goes into actually collecting the money, and sometimes for some transit agencies, it costs more to collect the money than actually the money you get. So there's some of those types of factors, but on the sustainability side, I know you mentioned the electrification, some of the other alternative fuels. I know we've seen that as a priority from various different administrations. It's something we've bantered about, looking a little bit more into that as we go forward within our transit technology program. What does electrification, alternative fuels look like in Northern Virginia industry-wise? So I'm definitely happy. I'll take that offline. I'll talk to Kate about that, and we'll see what options there might be for us to explore some of the sustainability and transit worlds.
Well, and two other quick things, Alan. One thing that's been talked about too on the advent of WMATA going to Apple Pay and potentially other payment type systems or having an electronic device thing. The desire to tie in all of this under one sort of app or whatever it is. I know maybe not everyone would have access to it, but good people will, and so it would help. Would make it easier for people to take a bus to get to Metro or Metro to the bus, or whatever. So that piece, and I'm going to say something a little controversial as well, Matt. So just reminding folks, prior to the pandemic, for probably the several years leading up to that, bus ridership was on a clear decline in this region, including the district. And so, it'll be interesting to see. Yes, people, I think are taking bus now because, I have friends in the district. Look, I'm taking the bus now because there are no cars on the road and the bus has been fast. But, the minute people start coming back, we're already seeing backups on the Beltway already, in the mornings and in the afternoons. Are people going to, does the bus become less convenient for folks, for some folks? So all these things I think are going to be questions or observations we're going to have to make moving forward. But, bus ridership was trending very much in a downward trend, for quite a while in this region prior to the pandemic.
Mr. Alcorn had his hand up, so I'm gonna go Mr. Alcorn and then Mr. Meyer.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, just very quickly to follow up on Matt's radical discussion about Metrobus. Yeah, I mean, honestly, and I've heard it from my colleagues in Fairfax that with the cuts and the scale backs of Metrobus, it's been a point of discussion. And in Fairfax, we have been moving to take on more routes that have been operated by Metrobus before. So that at some point that may be a hard discussion we need to have and see what's best for the region and overall. But anyway, Matt, thanks for bringing it up.
Yeah, and there are implications of that as well overall, given the compact. I mean, that's a big question, but it has come. I know it has come up because more and more the Metro bus is the DC bus. Yeah.
Definitely, Mr. Meyer and then Mr. Snyder.
Paul is correct about the ridership prior to the pandemic. We were monitoring it we've been monitoring it for a number of years. And so in 2018, we categorically made our buses free for all college students, all high school students, all middle school students. All of the routes in the city have their terminus at the Vienna Metro Station. Now, we also have stops that connect to the Fairfax Connector and to a Metro bus going to Seven Corners in Alexandria. But our primary focus is to move residents to and from the Metro Station and from the university to the Metro Station. And so when we did make it fare free for those categories, and as well as seniors, we saw our ridership increase about 30%. Now, we have been using hybrid buses now for 6 or 7 years. I think we're on the second generation of our hybrid buses. And we are talking about and making plans for possible all electric when it becomes viable from a technical perspective. So really, quite frankly, the incremental approach, we were taking that initially to encourage and increase ridership, and we still will with respect to it being fare free. But even if ridership is lackluster, or I hope it doesn't continue to drop, but even so, I think that there's just some other, on a smaller system, some basic advantages to making it fare free. Other than that, we go to an existential question as to whether we get out of the bus business in its entirety. I don't think that would be acceptable to the voters. So, and I think that there is enough support, at least in a smaller community, to go ahead and fund the Delta and make it permanent. And while at the same time, strengthening, making sure that our routes make sense and that we publicize the services robustly, so people will start to think about it from a convenience perspective and not just from a fare perspective. But I just share that with you. Thank you.
Yeah. Mr. Snyder.
Sure. So it seems to me that this will, unless it becomes a purely political, you're either for equity or you're not kind of a discussion, this can get very complicated and should be a complicated discussion. For example, if you're running a bus system that basically is financed by an institution in part, or clearly has economic benefits to your community, you may be willing to give it away because your funding structure is such that you get more of it back. If, on the other hand, you have minimal value from it, but you're running bus service almost as a public service for others outside of your jurisdiction, your view of whether it ought to be free or not might be somewhat different. I will also say that if we get into this existential discussion about whether we're going to go with more or all local service, we have a lot of work to do to create a truly system-wide in Northern Virginia. I mean, I'll just ask Kate, and because this is something we've talked about for years, but it's one thing to run a service in a limited geographic area at limited hours for limited purposes. It's an entirely different thing to say we're going to run a serious bus system made up of many subsystems for all of Northern Virginia. And so in essence, what you're doing is really creating a Northern Virginia system made up of smaller systems, but so far don't really fit together all that well. So I would just caution that before we leap to that alternative, we better have a pretty fully fleshed out alternative to offer, which is going to be far different than what we see out there today in terms of local systems. So the big thing for me is we need to talk about trade-offs. We need to talk about if you're going to reduce or eliminate fare from X number, how do you make that up? And is it other people pay more? Perhaps to some extent that's appropriate. Do you reduce service because you're getting less costs in? That wouldn't seem to be a very good approach, to reduce fares just to deliver inadequate service. So these are the kinds of trade-offs that are essential. But I think we all need to go into this really looking hard at what the elements are and collectively avoid this from becoming an easy yes or no sort of a kind of political with a small p kind of a thing, and approach it from an open mind. I certainly have that. I mean, we rely on Metro for our bus service. We tried a local service. It got into political issues because somebody took a picture of the vehicle, at night with one person on it and blew it up as a huge tax thing. And then it was during the financial crisis and was axed off as a symbolic gesture. So our own history with this has been very unpleasant. And I want to avoid other jurisdictions having to go through that. And I don't rule out anything here, but this is pretty hard, especially when you talk about a major change, such as substituting local service for Metro service. Anyway, enough of that, but I'm in agreement with pretty much the other comments as well.
And your point is very well taken, Mr. Snyder. I know, to the example that you just gave, we get that at times here in Alexandria as well, where people say, "Well, there's nobody riding on the bus. Why do we even have a bus system?" Right? So, no, totally get that, and also the nuance with connecting between all of Northern Virginia, right? Because, well, if I'm going to catch a bus from here in Alexandria to, say, Ashburn out in Loudoun, am I taking 4 buses? I'm making 4 connections. Is there one bus that I could take? So no, absolutely. Very, very good points. Ms. Matthijs, I don't know if there was anything that you wanted to add on to that.
No, I think that I actually very much appreciate all the comments about the complexity. That's part of the reason we wanted to do the white paper, was to step back and look at the policy considerations, because this is something that we know can become a very political conversation very quickly. So again, what we want to provide to all of you for your own jurisdictions and for the regional sake is some information so you can help insofar that you're trying to dive into these policy issues. And if I could add, one of the things we absolutely do recognize, and this is going to Mr. Letourneau's comments, is there's a difference in looking at specific individual systems and perhaps giving fare free for students or low income versus the overall sort of WMATA network. I think we're very careful. We will be very careful in individual systems versus the larger network that we have here in Northern Virginia. So again, we're looking forward to bringing this thought piece at July, sort of things for you to think up over the summer. And we appreciate all of the comments that we're getting now, because they really are helping work through these issues and understand sort of the complexities that you're all dealing with in your jurisdictions.
Can I just pile on one sort of piece of color, Mr. Chairman? So Loudoun, I'm well positioned for this discussion because Loudoun did opt out of WMATA bus, as some of you know, but some of you may not actually. So when we entered into the WMATA compact, it is rail only, and we are the first and only jurisdiction to do so rail only. So in its place, we have started a new system. It's not new anymore, but we started our own system, Loudoun County Transit, that is now, I think, expanding probably about as rapidly as anything has around here, adding significant numbers of fleet every year, in anticipation of having Silver Line stations to serve. So we're a little bit of a more modern, perhaps, test case for the phenomenon that Mr. Snyder described. And I'm sure I'll have some battle scars, but we did have to undertake an analysis of, was it more cost effective for us to do that or to be part of the WMATA system? And I think in this case, I think even WMATA felt that they would have difficulty providing adequate and any kind of valuable service as far out as Loudoun County. But I certainly don't think the discussion is about having no bus service, but I think it is worthwhile for us, separate from this fare discussion, to do a check-in of exactly what Virginia routes are running and what they look like and what sort of other routes are being run. In some cases, I know there are duplicate routes being run. And when we started paring routes down from the WMATA standpoint, the WMATA staff did as they should. They looked at, what are the routes that are less essential in this moment. And that's one of the reasons why Virginia routes were pretty heavily impacted by those service cuts when we had to make them as a result of the pandemic, because there was already other service covering a lot of that territory. And that was an eye-opener for me, honestly. I I've made similar comments before, but I really hadn't seen it in practice as much as recently. So it is kind of evolving. We'll see where sort of WMATA service ends up back at. But also, you know, for the test case, you can kind of see how we fare in Loudoun with our own system and not having any metro and also not paying the subsidy. And that's kind of the, you know, it's an interesting discussion. So the only other point I wanted to just emphasize that Paul made was, so on electrification, this is something that, you know, clearly there's a lot of interest in, and not just electrification. Actually, it's an important distinction whether we're moving towards zero emission buses or electrical buses, because there's potentially more than one way to get to zero emission. There's a lot of pressure on WMATA to set a goal, and the WMATA board has been talking about this. I think there's an impression out in the general public that we're just kind of ignoring the topic. Definitely not true. There's a tremendous amount of staff work that has gone into this so far. And it's super complicated because it is not just a WMATA decision, it is also a utility issue. You know, physically, can we get enough electricity to our bus depots? And unlike those of us who now have things like plug-in hybrids where we charge overnight, WMATA is going to have to do it during the day when you're dealing with peak electricity. So all those kind of issues are being worked out. There are various pilot programs out there, but the bottom line is there is a tremendous expense associated with this, a capital expense. You know, there will be a major investment needed in our WMATA capital, a much higher subsidy than what we're paying today. I think it's our hope that the federal government may come in with some programs, particularly with this discussion about infrastructure, and help big, large transit systems like WMATA pay for some of this. But I do want to flag it because and the reason Paul brought it up, we're going to have to decide fairly soon, probably, how much all of you want to pay to do this, to accomplish this goal, because you know, the time will come where WMATA starts moving towards this and starts making these capital budgets. And then I know we're going to hear from jurisdictional staff saying, wait a minute, my WMATA subsidy is going up by what? So you have to know that up front, that this is why, and it really does, I think, need to be a regional discussion and decision to do it and at what pace. And it's very easy for folks to sign on to a letter, as some had, saying, hey, WMATA, go do this. But, you know, when you get down to it, it's a much more complicated discussion, and we just need to be upfront about those costs. And that's also kind of what led me to sort of make the comment about we should probably look at the whole thing while we're doing that. I don't want to hijack this particular effort, but that is something that needs to take place as well.
Thank you, Mr. Letourneau. Any other topics of conversation? I think this has been a very robust meeting tonight, and one that I've enjoyed, and I think staff has been getting a lot of good input, as Ms. Matisa mentioned. All right, so let's see. I think that might be it. Alan, anything else from you?
I know, Mr. Chair, that's all I had.
All right, so before we adjourn, any other WMATA related issues or topics that anybody would like to bring before the committee?
Kanick?
Yes, go ahead.
I was not going to, in light of Paul's comment early in this meeting, that the scope of the mandate of this committee is captured in the agenda this evening, so it's not safety related. But since the last time we met on May 4, there was the accident in Mexico City. And I just want, for the record, to note that prior to this accident, I had already been interested in the efforts by Metro to improve its inspection of elevated structures. And I just want, for the record, I would ask that Paul and Matt continue to be mindful of the need for Metro to be aggressive in addressing their inspection program, which has areas for significant improvement. And I won't go into all of the details of it, but if you do want to learn more about it, there's some documentation from the Metro Safety Commission on this particular issue, and there's some ongoing initiatives that WMATA is taking in response to some of the recommendations by the commissions. So I think we need to be mindful that, and not sanguine that, oh, well, this couldn't happen here. As we increase the length of trains, increase the weight on our structures, we need to know what those structures are rated at. And at this point, we don't have any load ratings for any of our elevated structures in the system. And Paul and Matt are keenly aware of this already. So I just, given the fact that this happened just 16 days ago, I think that we just need to keep that in the back of our minds, that we do not want something that catastrophic happening in this system, because that would set us back in ways that we can't even anticipate. So that's my closing comment in response to your question, is whether I have anything else to say. But thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Mr. Letourneau?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Meyer is always a wonderfully courteous colleague, and gave me a heads up that he had this on his mind, and I appreciate that he did. And so I did have the opportunity to reach out to WMATA staff and get some additional information about that concern, and I'm going to pass that along to Dave and to the members of the committee here. So I won't do that right now, but suffice to say, the message definitely was received. The audit was taken seriously. WMATA has prepared some responses to it, has put in place some things, and also added some things to the capital budget to address some of those concerns. And then we also had a little bit of a discussion on the load issue, and we can get into that in detail. But I thanks to Mr. Meyer for bringing it up, and I'll be following up on that.
Thank you, Mr. Letourneau. And thank you, Mr. Meyer, for bringing that up. Oh, sorry, did you want
Thank you, Matt. Appreciate it.
And David, this is Paul. Paul Wiedefeld, and our chief safety officer, and I meet with the Safety Commission, the head of that, and their board chair somewhat frequently. And we talk about these various issues, or try to anyway. We're trying to make some headways there. So thank you for raising it. And at times too, I think, how the Safety Commission sees things and interprets things versus how WMATA does things are a little different at times. Not to take away from the seriousness of, we did get a report on the loads and all that stuff, but, those are the kinds of things that we let the experts worry about. And
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I do appreciate, and I understand the different cultures between an oversight organization and its independence and the operational organization. I understand all those dynamics, having worked in the regulatory field for almost 4 decades. So I do understand it. I just wanted, for the record, to say that this happened 2 weeks ago, and I just wanted to verbalize it to.
No. I'm not diminishing what you said at all. I just.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, thank you, Mr. Meyer. Like having actually ridden on the Metro Rail system in Mexico City and seeing some of it firsthand, I think there's plenty of examples to take from it. And I actually had to check on my family back home, make sure my cousin hadn't gone back to school. I was worried about that, and we definitely don't want to see something like that here. Anybody else? Anything else for the good of the order, if you will? Okay. So just want to remind everybody, excuse me, our next NVTC WMATA committee is scheduled for June 30th at 6 p.m. again. Reminder, this is the day before the July 1st commission meeting. The committee will be virtual again. We do not yet have committee meetings scheduled for the fall, but staff is looking at the next committee meeting in either September or October, and very likely will be an in-person meeting. So just a heads up to anyone. And I know that for our full body, we are also looking at potentially coming back in person or some type of hybrid eventually. So I think that's pretty much it for tonight. Staff, any last items or anything?
No, I think that concludes us.
All right. Well, just like to thank everybody again for all your time tonight, and we will be signing off until next time. Take care, everyone.
Good evening.
Okay.